Before They Were Legends, Part 6, Walt Disney. The man fired for lack of creativity. Imagine being told you are not creative enough, not talented enough, not imaginative enough. Imagine a newspaper editor looking at your work, shaking his head, and telling you that you lack good ideas. Now imagine hearing those words when your name would one day become synonymous with imagination itself. A name that would build an empire of dreams. A name that would create Mickey Mouse, Snow White, Disneyland, and one of the most powerful entertainment companies in history. But before the castles, before the theme parks, before the magic, there was a young man, fired from his job for lack of creativity. This is the untold story of Walt Disney, before he became a legend. Long before the world knew the name Walt Disney, there was simply a boy named Walter Elias Disney. He was born in 1901 in Chicago. His father, Elias Disney, was a strict and hard-working man. A carpenter, a farmer, a man who believed in discipline. His mother, Flora Disney, was warm and nurturing. But childhood for Walt was far from magical. When Walt was just 4 years old, the family moved to a farm in Marceline, Missouri. And Marceline would leave a deep imprint on Walt's imagination. The small town, the trains passing through, the fields, the animals, the quiet rhythm of rural America. Years later, Walt would recreate the spirit of Marceline in Main Street, USA, inside Disneyland. But as a child, life on the farm was not romantic. It meant hard work, very hard work. When Walt was just 9 years old, his father forced him and his brother Roy to deliver newspapers every morning, before dawn, in freezing winters, in rain, in darkness. They had to wake up at 3:30 a.m., then walk miles delivering newspapers. After school, they had to deliver the evening papers again. There was almost no time for play, no time to be a child. But Walt found something that gave him escape: drawing. He drew constantly, on paper, on scraps, on anything he could find. He would sketch animals, people, scenes from his imagination. Even then, Walt had a habit. He didn't just draw pictures, he tried to make them come alive. As Walt grew older, the Disney family moved again, this time to Kansas City. Here Walt discovered something new: commercial art, posters, advertisements, illustrations. He enrolled in night classes at the Kansas City Art Institute, but Walt struggled in school. Traditional academics bored him. What he wanted was simple. He wanted to create, to draw, to tell stories through pictures. But the world had different plans. In 1918, the world was in chaos. World War I was raging. Walt was only 16 years old, but he desperately wanted to join the army. He tried to enlist. He was rejected, too young. But Walt refused to give up, so he forged his birth certificate. He joined the Red Cross Ambulance Corps. Instead of fighting in the war, he was sent to France after the armistice. But even there, Walt was still Walt. He covered the ambulance trucks with cartoons and drawings. Other soldiers loved them. It made the grim environment lighter. Even in war, Walt could not stop creating. When Walt returned to Kansas City after the war, he needed work. He eventually got a job at the Kansas City Star newspaper, but the job did not last. One day, the editor called him in. The verdict was simple, brutal. He was fired. The reason? The editor believed Walt lacked imagination and had no good ideas. Let that sink in. The man who would later build the most imaginative entertainment empire in history was told he had no imagination. But here is the strange thing about Walt Disney. Rejection didn't crush him. It fueled him. Walt found another job as an advertising illustrator. There he met a talented animator named Ub Iwerks. Ub would become one of the most important figures in Disney history. Together, they experimented with animation. At the time, animation was still primitive. But Walt saw something others didn't. He believed cartoons could become cinematic storytelling, not just short gags, but emotional stories. This idea was revolutionary. Soon Walt started his own company. It was called Laugh-O-Gram Studios. At first, things looked promising. Laugh-O-Gram produced short animated films based on fairy tales, Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood. The stories were charming, creative, innovative. But Walt had a problem. He was a dreamer, not a businessman. The studio ran out of money. Employees went unpaid. Eventually, the company collapsed. Walt Disney was bankrupt. He had only $40 left in his pocket. In 1923, Walt made a decision that would change history. He packed a suitcase, a few drawings, and boarded a train to Hollywood. At that time, Hollywood was not the entertainment capital we know today. But Walt had a plan. Then he believed animation could become mainstream cinema. He partnered with his brother, Roy Disney. Together, they started a small studio. It was called Disney Brothers Studio. Walt created a series called Alice Comedies. It combined live action and animation. Audiences loved it. For the first time in his life, Walt Disney was experiencing success. But the success would not last. In the late 1920s, Walt created a character called Oswald, the Lucky Rabbit. Oswald became hugely popular, but Walt made a terrible mistake. He did not own the rights to the character. The distributor did. When contract negotiations happened, the distributor took Oswald away from him. And worse, most of Walt's animators left with the distributor. It was a devastating betrayal. Walt Disney had lost his biggest success. Again. On the train ride back to California, Walt was silent, thinking, planning, determined. If someone could take Oswald away from him, then he would create something they could never take. He sketched a small mouse, originally named Mortimer Mouse. But Walt's wife, Lillian, suggested a better name, Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse was different, but Walt took an enormous risk. He decided to create the first synchronized sound cartoon. It was called Steamboat Willie. In 1928, when audiences saw Mickey whistling and moving perfectly in sync with sound, they were stunned. And it changed animation forever. Mickey Mouse became a global sensation. And Walt Disney finally had his breakthrough. But success did not silence the critics. In fact, it made them louder. When Walt announced he wanted to create the first full-length animated film, Hollywood laughed. They called it Disney's Folly. No one believed audiences would sit through a 90-minute cartoon. Investors refused to fund it. The project nearly destroyed Disney financially. But Walt pushed forward. The film was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. When Snow White premiered in 1937, the audience was silent. Then they stood, applauding. Many were crying. It became the highest-grossing film of its time. The man once fired for lack of creativity had just reinvented cinema. But Walt was not finished. He didn't just want movies. He wanted a place where imagination could be experienced physically. A place where families could step into stories. In 1955, that dream became reality. Disneyland. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Think about it. The man who was fired for having no creativity created the most famous cartoon character ever, the first animated feature film, the first modern theme park, and a storytelling empire that still dominates the world. Rejection often arrives disguised as failure, but sometimes it is simply the world misjudging genius. Walt Disney did not become legendary because he avoided failure. He became legendary because he refused to let failure define him. So the next time someone tells you your ideas are not good enough, remember this. The man who built the kingdom of imagination was once told he had none at all. Before the castles, before the magic, before the legend, there was simply a young man with a pencil and a dream. And that dream changed the world.